So I'm pretty sure everybody in the entire world is terrible at drywall when they get started, me included. And as I've worked to get good at it over the years, I found ways that really work for me, and I would like to share those with you in this video. You'll be able to go from this to this to this. So one of the things that I want to start out with in this video is talking about this beveled edge on these sheets of drywall. So the whole idea behind putting up wallboard and finishing it is to basically make a bunch of individual sheets one sheet. And if you think about one sheet of drywall, it's pretty flat and relatively flawless. So when you see drywall in the stores, you'll see there's actually two sheets and they'll be brown on either side. And the reason they stack them like that is because they want to protect that finish that you're going to have showing into your room. So make sure that you do everything that you can to make sure that you don't damage this face at all, whether you scratch it with the other sheet of drywall or nick it up with a tool or something like that. Any damage that you cause to the board is going to have to be repaired. So what I consider one of the most important things in drywall is this beveled edge here. And every sheet is going to have two beveled edges. They're going to be parallel. And so whether you have a 8, 10, or 12 foot sheet of drywall, they'll be 4 feet wide, and then the length will be varying lengths. And then on the 4 foot sides, there'll be these little bevels. So in order to make one big sheet, of course, we're going to have to add the same type of materials. So we're going to add drywall mud and this paper tape. It's called paper tape that goes on top of this seam. These bevels are important because if you see, there's a gap there, and that's where your drywall mud and your paper tape is going to lay. If you end up hanging drywall in a spot to where there's no bevel, you see there's nowhere for tape to lay, and you're going to have to feather this mud out a ways to get rid of the seam that you're going to create. So on my ceiling, I hung 12 foot sheets of drywall, and you can see in the middle, on the 4 foot edges, there would be the bevel going down the middle. But at the end of these 12 foot sheets, you have a place where there is no bevel, where two sheets come together, and that's called a butt joint. And that's going to be problematic because I'm going to have to lay the tape right on top of the drywall itself, put the mud down, put the drywall tape on, and it's going to raise up the surface a little bit, and I'm actually going to have to feather the mud out. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to do that. There's no way around it. But basically, each one of these joints at the end of these boards, I'm going to have to do that. So if you look at what I finished so far, you can see that this is a beveled joint from ceiling to floor. And in the middle here, I have the bevels coming together. And on this wall here, once again, I have all the bevels coming together. So that's going to make it very easy to make flat walls here. In the corners, it doesn't really make a difference either way. You just want tight corners because there's tape that you're just going to lay in there and it's just going to have to feather out. But the corners aren't going to be as noticeable as if you have, say, a seam going down the middle of a wall. And even here, above my little cubbies, I also have the beveled edges coming together. So one of the reasons that I like hanging drywall vertically is there's going to be a flat space at the bottom to attach my baseboard. So if you do put the bevel at the bottom, you are going to have to fill in that bevel with drywall mud to get a flat surface. So in my last video, I told you that my father-in-law was nice enough to come over and help me hang some drywall. And the reason I started with the ceiling first is because the ceiling can do goofy stuff. Room can maybe not be square, or you might just end up having some issues here, like we had the wall isn't just perfect, and so I had to trim off some of the drywall to get the board to fit. But you can see the seam at the top is actually pretty tight. And so the first thing that you want to do is always hang your ceilings first. A lot of people will say, oh, you hang it so the boards sit there and help hold up the ceiling. And that's not right. What it does is it creates a flat surface so then you can push your boards up tight to the ceiling and not have a big gap to fill. So it was the same thing even with this ceiling. I put up the ceiling board first, and then I was able to push the pieces up tight up against the ceiling so I have a nice tight corner. Drywall is pretty forgiving, so you're going to end up with some little spots that maybe didn't cut out just right. But luckily with drywall mud and the way the tape works, you'll be able to fill all that in. And you also notice these corners are pretty bad looking. Don't worry about that. I'm actually going to show you what I'm going to do with that in the next video. This video I'm just going to specifically show you how I hang the drywall. So I needed power back here, so I went ahead and made these outlets hot. So all I did when I went to hang up this drywall is just take the screws out and just bend them forward, and then I was able to go ahead and hang my drywall the way I needed to. Because of these little ears, they'll actually sit on top of the drywall, and so you're not going to be able to leave these on the box and then go ahead and hang your drywall. You're going to have to take them either completely off, or all I do, just push them forward, then you'll be able to hang your drywall. And of course you can do the same thing for switches as well. So there might be a chance that you have hung the drywall yourself and you just want some drywaller to come by and finish it, and they probably told you no. And there's a reason for that. They kind of figure that homeowners are going to try to piece everything together and just try to use as many pieces as they can. And I think that's right, and even I did that when I first started out. And there's no reason why you can't reuse leftover pieces. If you notice on this wall, there's actually two tall pieces, but I have the beveled edge in the middle. That's because I used the halves from my top piece there. So that top piece used to be a 12-foot sheet of drywall. You always want to minimize the amount of seams that you have. And so if you're able to get 12-foot drywall, you should try to get it if you're going to have spaces longer than 10, 11 feet. So then you don't have that extra joint. And then even here in the back, these are actually 12-foot sheets that were cut down. And actually the ends of the wall pieces are actually those pieces right there. So there isn't a reason to waste anything. You can certainly reuse it. You just have to be wise about how you do it. And these pieces here in the back, there's a bunch of joints. And unfortunately, there's also the little spots where the drywall didn't quite cover up those braces. So maybe it's a good thing those didn't actually work out perfectly, because I'll show you how to hide those when I do the actual mudding and taping. Along with making sure that you don't put bevels in wrong places, around doorways, or where you don't want to bevel either. You don't want them at the floor, you don't want them around doorways or windows. And the reason is because you're going to have to put casing up there. So actually what I do is I just go ahead and hang my drywall, and then I take a Sawzall and just cut it out. And if you're an avid watcher of BrettleyBuilt, you'll remember that there's actually a door behind there. And I'm actually going to cut that out with the Sawzall too, once I get all this drywall out of my way. When installing drywall screws, I'll put 5 screws across the board, across the 4-foot portion. On sections that aren't on the 4-foot board portion, I just go about every 12 to 16 inches, I'll put a screw in. So I always use the coarse threaded screws. You can get number 6, number 8, doesn't really matter. The longest I would go is 1 5/8 inches. I go 1 5/8 inches. You can go 1.5 inches. This is 1/2 inch drywall that I'm installing. I use the 1 5/8 inches because I want to make sure that I have a pretty good hold on the board. But honestly, putting in the screws is where you can really get yourself into trouble. So if you remember when I was yammering on about installing wires and walls, remember I kept my wires pretty close to the back of the stud because I knew I was going to be using some longer screws to hold the drywall. But you might be in a position to where you have an interior wall, you don't know how deep the wire is, and then there might be a wall on the other side. And so you may not want to use an 1 5/8 inches drywall screw, you may want to use something shorter. I wouldn't go any less than 1.25 inches for sure on 1/2 inch drywall. So I just use an impact drill to install my screws. And you can see that there's a slight depression here, but it hasn't torn the paper. And the paper is actually a lot of the strength of the drywall. So I'm gonna go ahead and just do a demonstration of what you shouldn't do here. So once you've torn the paper, you've actually weakened the drywall a little bit. So to cut drywall, all you'll do is you'll just use a utility knife and you'll score the paper. And that's kind of where I was going with the screw demonstration of actually burying the screw in the drywall. As soon as you break this paper, you actually weaken the drywall quite a bit. And it's actually because of that, it makes it easy to cut and easy to work with. But you figure this is pretty strong here. And then even with just like a pretty weak score, you can easily break the drywall. So here's the tools that I'm going to be using for this job. And a couple of these tools, whether it be that little light hole saw or this T-square or that drywall saw, just go out and buy these things, even if it's only going to be for drywalling one bedroom or a garage or something. It's certainly going to be worth the money. And of course I use the impact driver. They do make a tip for the drywall screws. I don't really like using it. I just like using the drill with the Phillips bit. And then a chalk line, pencil, tape measure, and a utility knife. And I'm going to be using this little pry bar to sit against the floor and lift the board up. I'll just be able to step on it with my foot and get it tight against the ceiling. So to illustrate some of the principles that I use when hanging drywall, I'm going to be drywalling this area here, this one little cubby. So one thing I wanted to mention as well, if you notice the butt joints, how there's a full board and then you go a few feet down and there's the line across where the boards meet. And then there's the next board. You can kind of see how it's staggered. Definitely do that whether you're putting these long boards on walls, if you decide to hang it horizontally, or on your ceiling, make sure that you stagger everything. It's going to look a lot better when you go to finish it. So whenever you're measuring to cut around obstacles like light boxes or switch and outlet boxes, make sure you pick one point and measure everything off from that one point. And you'll see what I'm talking about here, to where you're going to start at, say, one wall, measure over to your light box or your outlet box, and then you're going to measure over to the next light or to the next obstacle, but you're always going to measure from the same point. And it's going to be the same way coming from the other direction, perpendicular from the other direction, to make sure that everything's going to line up properly. And then you'll transpose those measurements to your board and everything should work out pretty well. And like I said, you're always going to start with the ceiling first. So a little trick I use when I have to measure long distances and I don't want to sit there and try to hold my tape up, I'll come across to a certain point, to an even point. So I came across at 6 feet, made a mark, and then measured off from the other wall to come back. It was 54 inches. Luckily it worked out that closely. Since I need an even reveal to put my corner bead on, what I'm going to do is put this beveled edge here against the wall. So now I know the opening is 10 foot 6 inches long, but I'm actually going to take a little bit off, probably going to take at least 1/4 of an inch off, only because I know that the boards going up the walls are going to cover it up, and I want to make sure that if anything's unsquare, that the board can just kind of float in there and kind of get to where I need it to be. And then drywall is pretty forgiving, and you'll see what I'm talking about, especially in the next video, how you'll be able to cover up a lot of flaws and make your corners look really nice. So one thing that I didn't mention in the tools is this drywall hanger. I got this from Harbor Freight, and it's the reason that my father-in-law and I didn't have heart attacks and throw out our backs, put up these 12-foot sheets of drywall on the ceilings. And so even though this is a little board, I'm going to go ahead and put it on the drywall hanger, and I'll also be able to cut out the holes for the lights, so that's going to make it a lot easier as well. So I got this little hole saw from Lowe's. They actually do make a bigger one. These are actually for recessed lights, but they work really well for these little light boxes as well. You just want to punch a hole through the back, through the front, so you can see where the drill bit's supposed to go, and drill from the front back so you don't tear the front face of the paper. So I'm going to do this little face first, and all I'm going to do is just throw a bunch of scraps along there. And then the next video you'll see why I'm just using a bunch of scraps and why it doesn't really matter in this case. So the back walls here are actually 8 feet tall, so I'd be able to just use one sheet of drywall. But I do have that little indent there. So what I'm going to use is this piece here, and it actually has a bevel on it. And this is why you don't want to throw out a lot of your scrap, because I'm going to be able to make a little piece to fill in there, and I'll be able to make sure that all my bevels match up. So in a few places I actually had to install some drywall catches, and all those are just extra boards that kind of pad the wall out a little bit, so you'll have something to hook the drywall to. So what you want to make sure of is if you did install a drywall catch, or if you are meeting up with a wall where there's only a little bit of wood here, you want to make sure that you hang whichever side of drywall first to make sure that you don't end up not having anything to screw into here into the wall. And a perfect example of that is this 1x4 that I nailed onto this 2x4 here. So what I'll do is I'll hang this back wall first, and then my other drywall can go over, and I'll make sure that I have studs to catch in this other wall. So that top piece didn't line up just right. I thought I had it pretty level, but I didn't. So I did go ahead and move it down. I'd rather have the gap up in the ceiling rather than in the seam of the drywall. So on the back wall, there are studs that are 16 inches on center. But you see how I have a couple goofy studs in there just because I needed to get around that brace. So I'm going to start in the middle and work my way to the outside. I know that people had said, oh, well, whenever you do your framing, just come back 3/4 of an inch and all this other stuff. I mean, you can, but I've noticed whenever you hang your drywall and things like that, to me, it hasn't made that big of a difference. So I just go ahead and just frame it the way that I frame it. It's always worked for me. So on this piece of drywall here on the right, I'm not going to measure off from the wall because I want this joint to be tight. So wherever you want the joint tight, like the ceiling or other piece of drywall, you want to measure off from that piece. So of course it'd be easier just to go from the wall over to the outlet, but I don't know where it's going to land. So I'm going to start from here, work my way over. So on this side of the wall, I just started to make a little cutout. I have a beveled edge, and then I have nothing on the floor. So it's different than this one, and it'll save you filling in the mud there at the bottom. So what I wanted to do in this video was just give you some tips and tricks on how to hang drywall efficiently and just try to minimize the amount of finishing that you have to do. In the next video, I'm going to be putting on this metal edging in case you were wondering what's going to happen here, just to kind of preface what's going to happen. So what this metal edging does is it just sets on the corner, and then you'll just put screws in every so often. And you'll notice that I didn't get screws really close to the edge, and that's why. There's going to be screws that actually go in and hold this drywall as well. So when you do these corners, you want to make sure that they actually don't come to a complete 90 degrees. And the reason is you want this metal edging, or whatever you're going to use to cover it, the tape or whatever you're going to use, just to be able to make a nice corner. And if you look at this little edge here, I left this on there on purpose. If I was going to go try to put this metal edging on, it's going to kind of not let it fit just right. And so when I cut that off, this will be able to fit nice and square on the edge. So whenever you put this corner on, make sure that you don't have anything sticking out that's going to obstruct the edging. So I greatly appreciate you watching this video. I'm going to go ahead and get all the drywall hung in the next probably week and a half, 2 weeks, and then I can start finishing. So don't miss that video. If you think this video would help somebody you know, go ahead and share it with them. Drywall is not difficult. It just takes a lot of practice. And I've got to this point just by practicing, and it still isn't always perfect. So be patient with yourself if you have to do these drywall jobs, and eventually you'll become pretty good at it.